Racism is absolutely alive and well in this country.
There was a lot of anger because there's so much hurt.
Reconciliation is not my responsibility, is not just Indigenous people's responsibility. Let's change, let's transform, let's heal. Welcome to Two Aunties and Reconciliation. Well, here we are for another episode 3. We're going to delve into the Indian Act. But before we do that, for those viewers that are just chiming in, my name is Shapela Matsiam. I'm also known as Chief Leanne Joe. That is my given English name. I'm one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation, also known as the Squamish Nation. And I am your host for Two Aunties and Reconciliation podcast. My co-host is Shelley Joseph, my sister, and would love her to introduce herself again for our viewers.
Mm-hmm. Again, Gela Kesla, Kwakola word, meaning come well with me. So come well with us on this journey. Gela Kesla. Nuga Hekwagela Okwa. My traditional name is Hekwagela Okwa. My English name is Shelley Joseph. I come from a small village called Hopetown or Hagums. Happy to be here again with you today.
Yes, it's a journey that I'm glad to be undertaking with you and having these beautiful conversations about these topics that we want all of our viewers to engage with meaningfully, heartfully, with love and light and intentionality towards reconciliation and the actions necessary to achieve what I think is on our hearts and minds as aunties coming together to build on the work that we do on a daily basis. So again, welcome to our viewers. Our topic again for this episode is the Indian Act. We're going to delve into a bit of the history and the beginnings of how this act came to be, what the act is. Of course, just given the very limited time that we have, this is, I would say, just skimming the surface
Very much so.
of the Indian Act itself, because there's so many aspects to it that govern our spaces as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in this country. That I think probably this whole 8 episodes could probably just cover the Indian Act itself. But yeah, we're going to go into, again, a bit of that. There are some key pieces of that I think we should start with. There's a timeline, a succession, I think, that we could speak to begin our space about the Indian Act is prior to the Indian Act being established itself in 1876. We have things like, so the predecessors to the Act itself, of course, this begins back in the 1400s when countries that settled Canada started exploring the world with the intentionality of, and what they held with the intention of exploring was the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius. We're going to speak a bit to that, where, we got to talk about when they came to the country, and that intentionality of just being visitors on our lands, and not really having that intention of settling. But I think once they started exploring our country, discovered that it was a country of abundance and plenty of wealth.
What
That
they call resources.
Yeah, exactly. The wealth that they saw that they could benefit from.
Yeah.
And
Financially.
exactly, exactly. And you know, speak to after the beginning of more and more non-Indigenous peoples coming to our territories and exploring the lands coast to coast, was the spreading of diseases, different things that were diets that were never a part of our realm before. Um, Alcohol was a huge,
They
item
introduced
that
it.
they introduced to us and traded, and sugars and again, dietary things that were never a part of our existence before. So there was big introductions into uh, those significant changes in who we are, and how much that has impacted us as well. I think I do want to bring up the biggest land grab in this country is Rupert's Land, and speaking about that a little bit, which was Hudson's Bay Company selling a huge, massive chunk of our territories to the federal government, and that ownership being transferred from a corporate entity to a government without any consultation, without literally anything, any of us. We weren't included in any of that.
Yeah, and without them actually owning
Exactly.
the land.
Exactly. Basically just stealing our land and selling it off for their own benefit. There's the War of 1812. We have the British North America Act. It's now known as the Constitution Act. The huge impacts after that, of course, is the actual establishment of the Indian Act, which introduced residential schools, Indian day schools, 60s scoop, potlatch ban,
Yeah.
and just so many other spaces.
The band election system.
Band election system, the reservation system, like all of these things that we are still dealing with today. I think many Canadians don't know that we didn't even have the right to vote in this country when Canada was established. That right didn't come to us until 1960. We couldn't even protect ourselves.
From any of this.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Because
imposed on us, we weren't allowed to hire lawyers or even gather in groups of more than 5 to raise funds to fight any of this legally. So our hands were tied.
literally,
tied.
exactly, to, again, protecting our own basic rights as the first peoples of this country. Briefly mentioned the white paper and the opposing red paper that came with, the former Prime Minister Trudeau, not this one, but
His father.
his father. The Constitution Act of 1982. And one of the big things I think too that a lot of settler Canadians don't know about was the largest Royal Commission ever done in this country, is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. That was done in 1986. I like to speak to it because being a young person back then, and how much hope I had back then for our people.
Yeah, I think both of our fathers are really already politically situated and involved. So
Yes.
you and I were privy to things that were going on. As
Exactly.
teenagers, I was like, wow.
I know,
Yeah.
right? Again, just an abundance of hope. That, and the hardest lesson I would have to say in that hope was when nothing was done.
Yeah.
And that hope being crushed utterly
Yeah.
as a young person.
Yeah,
Right.
very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was the former Prime Minister, Mr. Harper, back in the day, that did, again, the largest royal commission, and nothing was done. And it's a beautiful, I think, one of the first major pieces of what I would consider what we're doing today as reconciliation. It could have been the foundation
Absolutely.
of what we could have built back then
Yeah.
and from 1986 onward.
Yeah. A really good example of all the hard work that our ancestors have done to create a better living situation for us in Canada, and no follow-up, no follow-through.
No.
Yeah.
And again,
Over and over again.
5 volumes of a royal commission, to me, again, was heartbreaking to see
Shelved.
100% shelved, and nothing, as a result. I shouldn't say that's not literally the case because, of course, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and our uncles, our cousins, and ourselves have all done work towards what was laid out in that royal commission. We have made progress, but it wasn't without a fight.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't without going to court, right? It wasn't without hiring lawyers to protect all of what we were trying to do back then, right? Kind of thing. But that's the really high level significant pieces around this abbreviated timeline, and how the Indian Act came through all of that. First, let's discuss Terranelius and the doctrine of discovery. This totally impacted the inherent title and rights that we had as First Peoples of our lands. And I think that's one thing I think too that we really need to get across in us sharing today is we literally are the First Peoples of our own territories. There was nobody here before us. Our origin stories state that, show that, demonstrate that, share the history of that, and understanding that as the First Peoples of our territories, everybody that came to our territories are literally visitors to our land.
Exactly.
Right? I go back to, Bo and, being on the legislature buildings and breaking a copper on that and the significance of what that represented in the words that he shared, even back then, and how they still resonate with not only me, but how that also then will influence what our children and our sons and our nieces and nephews are doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about doctrine of discovery. This allowed the Crown to claim sovereignty over First Nations peoples' territories and their land by holding Indigenous people not being able to claim ownership, right? Like, again, this notion of ownership is such a colonial term. It's such a capitalistic way of thinking.
And it wasn't how we existed.
No.
So the doctrine basically said that we were savages and nomads, and that was how they claimed that we didn't. We weren't owning.
We didn't have title to it.
Exactly, yeah.
Right?
So they kind of twisted the truth to fit their agenda.
Exactly.
To be able to come and claim.
Exactly. Oh, well, you don't stay here permanently.
Yeah.
Right? Therefore, you must not make use of it. Meanwhile, being nomadic people that moved, because we lived on a 13 moon cycle, we lived by natural law. We moved with the seasons. We moved with the resources and the abundance that Mother Earth was giving us.
Yeah, and it was very much circular. It wasn't. We weren't, wandering nomadically. We were following and going in cycles. So
exactly.
Round and around and around in the same territory the entire time.
Exactly.
Just different village sites according to the seasons.
Exactly. As well as our shared territories with our neighboring nations.
There were no hard lines.
No, exactly. Right. Because I can speak to, for those that are watching and live in British Columbia, Whistler is not a settled territory of the Squamish people. It is a shared territory between Lillooet and Squamish, right? And nobody settled there permanently.
Right.
It was a beautiful resource space that we all
Took care of.
and we had that agreement and understanding that we would ebb and flow through this shared space together, right? And so that abundance and thriving wasn't, again, just a nation only perspective, right?
Yeah.
And taking care of that land and the responsibility and accountability,
Yeah.
again, was totally shared.
Yeah. So I think another thing that they skewed about the truth was that we had social structure, governance systems, economy systems, not how they understand economy, but our own economy systems, sustainability practices. We had what they would call religion or spirituality. We had everything that encompassed what Western society would deem a society.
Exactly. Or civilized.
Yeah, civilized. They conveniently left all of that out.
Exactly.
Or they just didn't want to see it. However, that's not in any of the history books when I was growing up.
Exactly. Well, and the complexities that come along with, and none of those are siloed spaces. Like, so when we talk about economies, when we talk about governance, when we talk about sustainability, spirituality, like these aren't spaces unto themselves. They are fully intertwined and interconnected together in how we lead a good life, how based on our value system, right? Based on our relationship with all living things.
Very much relationship.
Yeah, with our own spirit, with the ancestors, with the people yet to be, with the universe.
With the land.
Exactly. Like all of these, again, I go back to our origin and non-origin stories, our songs, our protocols, our practices, and again, all tell us all of these things. It embeds who we are, right? We get our discipline and we get our critical thought. We understand the consequences of that natural law and those relationships in this space. And again, being completely ignored.
Yeah.
I would say ignored because
Absolutely.
I think that's the case. And, as it relates to, again, I would like viewers, listeners to be able to see that this wasn't a choice by us, that it was very much, a worldview that was literally forced upon us from the beginning.
Yeah.
From when settlers or non-Indigenous peoples first started arriving here, that was in their hearts and in their minds about how they saw the world, and that was the only way.
Yeah.
And that's a really harsh reality, especially when you're on the receiving end of that reality. And so it's, again, it's impactful when you start to unpack, right?
True history.
The true history, the true understanding, the true intentionality of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of terra nullius is where land that is legally deemed, again, legally deemed. Our legal process, our justice system, again, is embedded in our systems. It isn't a siloed, precedence-based law, right? It's, yes, I think it was through our peers and through the community and the nation where justice and laws were laid and understood, and but we also knew as citizens of our nation, or belonging to a community, what our role of responsibilities, what are our accountabilities, and what purpose we played, in that governance structure, in that justice space.
And that everybody had a role to play in that.
Exactly.
Very much unlike the societies we live in today.
Exactly.
Everybody woke up with that purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was identified from a very early age. You were taught by many, right? It wasn't a, you're valuable to your nation by receiving that type of education. It was like, no, you learned a lot. And as your gifts were shown to the community, and to the leadership and to your families, that's when they started uplifting
Yeah.
and saying, hey, I think you need to master your gifts.
Your natural gifts.
Exactly. And what your purpose is here. And this is the greatest way that you're going to contribute to, right, the greater good of the people.
It was a lifelong learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Didn't take 4 years.
Yeah. We weren't memorizing things from a book.
No, you weren't theorizing about it, and it was
tested.
practical, right? I mean, I go back to my son's rites of passage training, right? And this space that we held for him to do that, because it's a practice that I don't think is like super prevalent in our communities today.
Yeah.
And that is practiced like really regularly. And just the space that we held as parents, because my husband always said, the youngest child and the only child were always the hardest to train, right? And I was very cognizant of that, right? And he was very cognizant of that because he wasn't doing the training. Parents aren't, of course, allowed to be training. It's the aunts and the uncles and others in the community that are training these young women and these young boys. But I go through and understand the discipline, right, that it took to do the ceremonies and to be out on the land, to go into freezing water and to fast all day long, and just all of the beautiful things that he did throughout, and what that really gave him, right? And it's things that you don't get in modern society, right? You don't go to school for these things. They're not naturally embedded.
Yeah. And I think that's a discipline in itself. Like prior to colonization, those were practiced and all the young boys would go through it. But now our sons are growing up in this modern world with all the technology and everything that they're exposed to on a daily basis. And then they get put in these ancient practices. And in my mind, I would hope that they appreciate it even more, having experienced what life is like out here and how they're feeling in these moments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, when Isaac's out on the land, when he's in ceremony, when he's at a potlatch, name giving, whatever it is, if it is community based, if it's culturally based, he is in his best place.
Yeah.
Right? He's just so connected.
Yeah. His highest self.
Exactly. Like just his true essence comes alive. Right? And he's just in the most grounded space, and he's the most curious, right? And just wants to absorb it all. He can't absorb it fast enough, right? And so I love that. I love the fact that he can go into these spaces and, be 100% a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be my hope that all of our youth get to be able to experience those types of environments.
Yes.
Because it's not always the case.
Well, so much of what we're talking about, I mean, we talk about even just the early pieces of the doctrine of discovery and Terry-Nellis itself. And what is this already stripped from us?
Yeah. Already the displacement.
Exactly. Totally taken away. So I want to mention before we move on that the doctrine of discovery finds its roots in the 1455 Papist Bull of the Roman Catholic Church. Viewers can take a deeper dive into both the doctrine of discovery and Terry-Nellis. I don't think we need to go into the depths of that because I think it'd probably take up the rest of the episode.
Yeah, I do want to say in recent years, the church published an apology of sorts.
Yes.
Yeah.
but
of sorts.
you have to denounce, like you have to totally denounce
Yeah.
the doctrine of discovery and paternalistic, because I'm sorry, because we consistently, as First Peoples, consistently have to fight the governments for every ounce of our title and our right, right? For removing ourselves from the Indian Act. Like literally everything we have has to be done and proven in a legal system that isn't ours.
Yeah.
That wasn't built around our worldview, our lens, again, without consultation to anything about who we are. And so when you look at legal precedents and you look at the court cases, they literally hone in still on terra nullius. That's how the provinces and the federal government go into court cases, right? And I think settler Canadians really need to understand that
Yeah.
this, again, isn't historical. This is upheld in our current justice system, and they call it justice.
Yeah.
But it's based on a foundation, again, that isn't ours. And that truth needs to be told. We have to hold that. And, for those that are in these spaces, being really curious about what it is to dismantle this. What is it to decolonize your space, especially in a legal realm where policies are being made, right? Because again, this history is very much still alive and well in our society and our decision-making spaces today.
Yeah, and things that were deliberately left out of the education system. In the
Exactly.
history books. So
Exactly.
yeah. Dive deeper.
Totally. Because you can never learn enough,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Because there's just so many layers to learning, let alone unlearning,
Yeah, yeah. That'll
right?
play a big part.
Because when I speak to, when I'm holding spaces, it's always learning is an action, right? It's very much a big part of the action of reconciliation is to learn some more, dig deeper, know more. Again, because there's just so many layers
Yeah.
of this. And then it's also to practice, what do I need to then unlearn? How do I decolonize my heart, my mind? And, that's a curiosity. And again, I think a different episode to talk about what that actually means and what can be done in that space. I want to speak specifically about our inherent rights. This was, again, naturally a part of, our understanding of what our rights are
Right.
as First Peoples of our own territories and of our lands and of our resources. But with that isn't ownership.
Right.
Like, I can't remember who's the one that said it, but it's always stuck with me of we don't own the land. We just borrow the land from our children.
Yeah. I heard we belong to the land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, in a majority of our languages actually translates into that type of
Yeah,
relationship.
absolutely. That's the key word, relationship.
Exactly. And that we're not separate. I am not separate than the land itself.
Yeah.
Totally belong to it because it was here before we were. Right. So going back to inherent rights but again, under legal terms, we, in modern times, we have to respect that under the Constitution, there is Section 35 of the Constitution that affirms our legal inherent title and our right. And happy to delve into that. But again, probably another episode unto itself to delve into Section 35 because it's pretty straightforward. But the legalities around that and the relationship of title and rights is complex.
Yeah.
Very complex. Because when you look at relationship between First Nation community and municipalities, First Nation community and provincial government, First Nation communities and federal government, I mean, just those three levels of government alone, I look at negotiations, that sort of thing that happens between nation-to-nation relationships. And generally speaking, the first thing that is taken off of any real work moving forward is generally title and rights, because nobody actually ever wants to deal with it, and nobody ever actually really wants to claim, wholly say, oh yeah, no, you for sure have a title and right. Right? So it's the first thing that is negated most of the time in those spaces, which again breaks my heart. I mean, what, for me, the legacy of what that leaves, because that brunt of that work then now is then nationally or naturally embedded in our children's future.
Yeah. Whatever we're not doing today, they're going to carry that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of decision makers see that
Yeah.
all the time.
Absolutely.
Right. And again, breaks my heart every single time. Again, for our viewers, grandmother Google knows a lot. Ask her about Indigenous or First Nations title and rights. Read up on Section 35. This comes both what we're speaking to. I'm going to go back to what we spoke to in episode 2. There are, again, tons of resources out there. Land Back, Cash Back by Yellowhead Institute talks a lot about title and rights, talks about Section 35. And of course, the Royal Commission talks about it, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. OECD has a bunch of materials, published materials out there also that speak to a lot of these spaces. I think that's one thing I hope that we get across in these episodes is the abundance of the roadmap being laid already for settler Canadians to delve into.
Yeah.
Right? Because it has been laid. I mean, it was laid, in our grandparents' and parents' generation. And it's demonstrated through RCAP. It's demonstrated through the Royal Commission on, the Truth and Reconciliation Report and its 94 calls to action. Again, just so many places.
UNDRIP.
Exactly. There's just so many to name. Yeah. But so again, learn, read, engage, be curious, have discussions. You can't state that enough. Okay, so the Indian Act. So we have the origins of the Indian Act, of course, come from the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's also built on the 1857 Gradual Civilization Act. That's literally an act for Indigenous people to become civil. Because we weren't, I guess, according to settler Canadians and to the federal government.
So even in that language right there, shame.
Yeah, exactly.
Has been imposed on us. Not our shame.
No.
It was never ours to own, but we just heard it from the beginning and even till now. Their condescension of who we are.
Yeah. And I'm curious. That's one thing when we do our work, when we're out there facilitating spaces and having these discussions with settler Canadians, I'm wondering if they even understand that. If they see that in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? The Gradual Civilization Act. Right? Do they see that shame? Let alone feel it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I always talk about this truth that we're discussing today about the Indian Act, and I call that Canada's history.
Exactly.
Up until recently, everybody's called it Indigenous history, but it's not my history.
No.
I didn't do this to anybody. This is Canada's history, and I always follow up with our history prior to colonization.
Right.
To help mitigate some of the shame that's been imposed on us through the Indian Act.
Absolutely.
And all these other acts, things that they've done.
I know. Because there's many.
Yeah.
There's many. There's also the Act for the Protection of Indians, which is around the 1850s, as well as the Indian Reserve System that was also established in the 1850s. Again, this is prior to the formalization of the Indian Act itself in the Constitution. happy for viewers to, again, do a little bit of homework, delve into this space. There's not a lot written on this. I've attempted to delve deeper into these spaces. However, there's one place that I know that grandmother Google doesn't have a ton of information on. Like, there's not a lot published out there about these, which is, again, breaks my heart, because if it's not out there, then how do people learn? How do people engage? How do people find out more? So, formally in 1876, the Indian Act was established. The Indian Act, it's high level. It defined who was an Indian, because it's a legal term that defines who we are as status Indians under the Indian Act. So it defines First Nations status, non-status, Inuit, and Métis individuals under the Indian Act. It controlled Indigenous governance, like all forms of Indigenous governance. Regulated reserve lands, again, that comes from the previous act, and embedding, moving us into a reservation system. So the reserves lands that were reserved for the use for the Indians, because we're still
under the Indian Act.
we are wards of the crown.
Yeah.
As a status Indian, I hope viewers understand that we are literally wards of the crown under the Indian Act. So we are literally federal responsibility.
Literally under their own creation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Not by our choice.
Yeah.
And we then have to carry a status card
To say
that I'm a status Indian and I'm recognized as a status Indian under the Indian Act. And that we all carry an individual number that goes along with that status.
that it expires and we have to renew.
Yeah, because, heaven forbid you are an expired Indian. It also talks, like, we can't go into the depths of how it mitigated us to our culture, which is our identity. Right? It's our values. It's our governance system. It's our justice system. It's our education system. It's all of these things. It wasn't just culture. Culture isn't something that we wear.
Not entertainment.
No, exactly. Yeah. It's not just the button blanket or a cedar hat or jewelry. Culture is literally everything about who we are and how the intentionality of the act to remove that from every ounce of who we are. And that was done in numerous ways.
Yeah. Very intentionally.
Extremely intentionally. Right? And I hope viewers hear that this didn't happen by accident. Right? This was very intentional by the federal government.
Yeah. I do want to say that around almost the exact same time they created the Indian Act, they also created the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and used them very extensively to enforce the laws that they had created.
Exactly. Like forcibly moving people to the reserve system.
Reserves, yeah.
Oh, I could go into.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of
there's a whole lot attached to that relationship. Well, not even, or the lack of relationship, again, oppressive spaces.
Absolutely.
Right? How the RCMP was used to forcibly remove children from their homes and their families to take them to residential school.
Yeah.
And even to today, they are the first call when there is any kind of civil disobedience, right? Around protecting land, water, about protecting anything about who we are.
Yeah. Our children, when the ministry's called.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's that extension of the government called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is a force, I think, that was purposely chosen.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely created to solidify their agenda.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Huge impact through the Indian Act is the discrimination against women. Huge, huge spaces. I would love to hear what your insights or what you'd like to share about that space.
Yeah, I think they went really hard on us women,
Mm.
Indigenous women, because we were so empowered before colonization.
Right.
We were in all the spaces where decisions were being made and had heavy influence on how things were run in our nations, in our villages, in our homes. And even today in Kwakwaka'wakw potlatches, when I was growing up, there would be a man speaking and the chief, usually a man, there are women chiefs, but would be, stood up as the speaker spoke for him. But everything that they were saying and doing was because the wife or the mother or the auntie would come and, whisper in their ear, this is what's happening next. All they were was the voice.
Exactly.
We made all the decisions.
Exactly.
And I believe they've seen how empowered we are and did everything they could to disempower that, because
Right.
we were definitely an obstacle to their agenda
Exactly.
of oppressing and, eradicating Indians here in
Exactly.
Canada. So they went extra hard. There have been fights over the years to, for instance, Indian women getting their status back if they married out.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it was just pushing them out of the system as much as possible. And at the same time, a non-Indigenous woman could marry an Indian man and get status. It blew my mind. I didn't understand it back then, but I get it now. They knew that this non-Indigenous woman who wasn't raised the way we were raised, she couldn't come into our families and communities and make any kind of impact.
Right.
She was raised that way.
Right.
So I think they knew that. So
Right.
like, yeah, we'll do this. And there are still points within the Indian Act that continue to oppress Indigenous women still.
Oh,
and I know
yes.
that NWAC is, they're doing certain things to have those amendments changed in there.
And NWAC stands for
the Native Women's Association of Canada. Yeah.
Just for our viewers. Because I know what that means, but they may not. Right.
They continue to fight those legislations that continue to oppress us under the Indian Act.
Yes.
One of them being, and it's already been amended, but just an example, we were the very last demographic. 10 years after all other women, 10 years later, then we were allowed to vote.
Exactly.
So those little fights like that
Exactly.
continue to happen today, but we were highly, highly oppressed under the Indian Act because I believe it's for that very reason, because we were so empowered.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, and the fact that we literally had to take the federal government to court to get Bill C-31,
Right.
Bill C-3, right, to get our own status back, to get recognition under this act, to be recognized as an Indian in their own legal regime that they've created.
Yeah. Another piece of that was we were never allowed to run for chief and council.
Right. Right.
The system that they created.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So many things. The list goes on and on and on about the oppression of us. And I think that really plays into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is a whole nother episode.
Totally
Sure, get
different.
there.
Yes. We'll get into that. But that's a huge piece of it. With having your voice, your identity stripped from you for
to look and feel invisible, to live in fear every day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So last couple of things is it totally enabled enfranchisement of all Indigenous peoples. You couldn't vote, you couldn't hire a lawyer, and if you did, you were enfranchised. If you lived off reserve, you were enfranchised. If you went to war, you were enfranchised. If you went to post-secondary schooling, you were enfranchised.
So enfranchised means losing your status. Of becoming a Canadian only.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
and I do want to mention, when they created the reserve systems, we were forced from taking care of all of this huge land and everything, forced onto these little patches.
And most of them useless patches.
Yeah, useless. You couldn't harvest, couldn't grow, and we weren't allowed to anyways. But then, as you mentioned, we became dependent.
Yeah.
So we could only eat whatever foods they brought to the reserves, sugar, flour, the things that you had mentioned. And it was then, I believe, all the diseases that are still
prevalent,
rampant in our communities were formed then.
Yes, exactly.
We had none of our natural resources that we ate before, the healthy
Well,
things. It was
when you couldn't
slaughter
hunt,
and
fish,
sugar,
gather,
because it
right?
was illegal.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Natural medicines that were given to us,
yeah.
right?
So and I couldn't imagine the depression that came with that, being taken from
Anxiety,
yeah,
dispossession, disconnection, lack of, again, everything about who we were.
yeah. On top of the shame that was coming
Exactly.
from
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I go back to our thinking about our ancestors and, you know, the resilience it took, right, to move through that space,
Yeah.
to fight, to survive.
yeah. So that
Right.
you and I could sit here and know our cultures and know our songs and know
Exactly.
some of the language and sing,
Exactly.
everything. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so much of our lives became controlled
Yeah.
by Indian agents, because yes, there were Indian agents that controlled every single decision.
Yeah.
We didn't govern ourselves under the Indian Act.
Right.
Some non-Indigenous person in some downtown office and in Ottawa made all of our decisions,
Yeah.
right? And influenced what that looked like. And a little bit of a story as we wrap up this episode really hits home. And I'm sure you have an equivalent one. But I remember my late father, Chapelam Siam, Chief Philip Joe, sharing how they used to go to the basement of the church and sing hymns, right? The Indian agent was coming, right? Because he had to catch a ferry from downtown
Yeah.
to North Vancouver, because we were, of course, all displaced from our communities
Right.
and forced to live in North Vancouver.
Right.
But anyway, Indian agent was coming. They would gather because the Indian agent found out, of course, we were gathering and came to oversee what was happening and what was shared and all that kind of stuff.
To make sure that you weren't practicing cultural anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Because it was illegal.
absolutely. So they would sing hymns for hours. And then finally the Indian agent got, one, I think, sick of just listening to these Indians sing hymns, but also needed to catch the last ferry back to Vancouver. And then they would have ceremony, right? So they would go underground after and practice and do everything what they could,
Yeah.
given the
Under that stress and pressure. And
exactly, to keep alive about who we were, what our ceremonies were, and to start and to continue to share knowledge and leadership and all that kind of stuff. And because if they didn't, I would not be chief today.
Yeah.
Right? I would not have that responsibility within my family if my parents didn't do that, if your parents
yeah.
didn't do that, if all of our ancestors didn't, all of these things would be officially not a part of our lives anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. We would have been fully assimilated as they wanted.
Exactly.
Yeah. But here we are.
But I love that active resistance. It fuels my fire,
Yeah.
when we talk about and share these stories
Yeah.
of that active resistance, that active resilience,
Yeah.
right? And knowing that their scarcity model wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I just love that idea that despite the fact that we are still confined by an Indian Act. I do want to speak to close also, because you and I were chatting earlier about this of, well, why don't you just get rid of the Indian Act then? Because I get that a lot as well
Yeah. Yeah.
in spaces. I'm hoping that maybe you can share a bit more about your thoughts around, well, you guys should just get rid of the Indian Act.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when I was working with Reconciliation Canada, traveling across the country, talking about reconciliation, yada, yada. And people would say literally, well, why don't you just get rid of the Indian Act? After sharing everything that we had just talked about. I was like, do you mean us, Indigenous people?
Right.
I'm like, yeah. I'm like, we did not create the Indian Act. Nobody in their right mind would want to live under the Indian Act.
Right.
Federal government did that.
Yes.
And I also think we've been living under the Indian Act for so many generations now. There needs to be a transition period
Yes.
to give us grace to unlearn generations of being under the Indian Act. This
Yes.
the most oppressive document in the world.
Right.
So much so that Africa came to model from the Indian Act to, and apartheid and everything.
Exactly.
They took that model from us
Yes.
and made it work over there.
Yes.
But we're going to need a grace period if that's ever going to happen.
Right.
To get rid of the Indian Act, for us to unlearn all of that oppressive
Right.
everything and then relearn and step back into the way that our ancestors governed ourselves. Yeah. Probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but man, that's my big blue sky picture.
Exactly.
That we
Well, and I think we're in a space, we're going to talk about this in our last episode of Ancestral Futurism and speaking with some youth about, like you said, that may not happen in our lifetime. However, you and I will be ancestors,
yeah,
in the spirit world, having a grandiose party celebrating
with them.
the fruits of our labor from, like, again, they'll be standing on our shoulders like we stood on our ancestors' shoulders, and etc.
All the work that's been done.
And that this resistance, this resilience, this thriving is as a result of our continued efforts.
I heard an elder speak one time about the frustration that we all feel because we're still stuck under these oppressive ways right now, and that we're so frustrated that this is where we are. Oh, and then we get angry, right? This is where a lot of violence comes from. But he goes, but you forget to think about, my parents started here. Your my dad did all this stuff back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and little by little, this little turtle, we'll call it, because we're on Turtle Island, inched and inched and inched. And we're here.
I know.
Look at it like that.
I know.
Man, they
The
did
abundance.
a whole lot for us. Yeah.
The
So
abundance.
if we can get to that
Right.
place of a mindset, I think it would just send us in a trajectory
Right.
a lot quicker than sitting in the victim
Space.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that that's a beautiful place to end our episode. And hopefully the viewers feel that. They can imbue that and move away and shift their mindset and their lens and worldview around building relationship with us from that space. So thank you again for being here. Beautiful discussion. Again, I told you, we're going to hit very surface level of what the Indian Act is. But again, ask Grandmother Google and look it up, read it. Beautiful, beautiful book.
Yeah.
Written by Shelley's brother. That's a great start.
Yeah.
That's an amazing
Beginning.
start. It's the beginning part of the journey.
21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph.
Yes. As well as, there's so many. Our cousin, Judy Wilson-Raybould, her books are amazing. There's just so many. So let's delve deeper into these spaces, and I hope that you learn more, that you grow more, and that you have an open heart and mind moving into those spaces. So Gayla Keslaw for being here and sharing your wisdom and sharing your words and sharing your passion with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, see ya.
I love you so much, and I love everybody listening, even if I don't know you. I love you.
Exactly.